I'm joined today by Carl Tannenbaum, who's the chief economist with Northern Trust, and he's just made a very interesting speech at the Asian Investment Summit here in Hong Kong. But you wanted to talk about some of the issues around inflation and growth. I wonder whether you could just basically tell us your assessment of how that's playing out in a global picture and how it affects Asia in particular.
Of course. So I use the metaphor of a train and where the cars are on the train and how fast it's growing as an umbrella for talking about the global outlook. Some of the usual locomotives are a little slower, the big developed economies, because they're dealing with debt in the post-crisis era, because we may have some secular stagnation, some long-term underinvestment in human and physical capital and demographic challenges. And really the interesting window that we have here in Asia is some of the emerging economies may be able to move towards the front and actually draw the rest of the world along with them. China obviously is the biggest candidate for that. They've done very well. They're restructuring a little bit, so they may have to level off a bit. But some of peripheral Asia, emerging Asia, continues to do quite well, and with some careful management. In the long term, we all are hoping that they'll join the front of the train and pull others along with them. We need to be foresighted to do the things that it takes to keep our economies growing. And there I talked a lot about infrastructure investment, making sure that there are enough funds for that and it's done in the right way, as well as trying to make sure that we educate our people to accept the sort of jobs that are going to be there in the next 20 or 30 years. That is an opportunity that I think all countries need to seize.
There's a lot of talk about the China growth story, and you yourself basically said that obviously as an old school economist, you had trouble with the doubling of the Shanghai stock market in the last year, for example. Do you see some major issues with the China growth story? In the short term?
China's certainly having to manage very carefully from a very high level of activity to something that's more sustainable, to use their own words. Certainly in the real economy, the fall of manufacturing has required careful thinking about what will replace it. And the Chinese have also done the sorts of financial reforms and repair that is needed, given that they have a lot of leverage and they've had some challenges with some of their banks. That said, China is also trying to become a broader part of the world community by getting its RMB accepted, by leading some of the infrastructure investment here in Asia. So it's always perhaps easier to make early progress than to become a fully mature member of a region, and China's certainly working hard at making that transition.
You also mentioned in the central bank context that each of the central banks really need to chief economists or whatever, need to look globally and understand what each is doing in terms of the transition of the world economy back onto a growth path. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Central banks around the world are given mandates by their legislatures usually to focus on domestic fundamentals. But of course, in this day and age, the inflation in any one country, no matter how large or small, is dependent on activity around the world. So the briefing books that all central banks are studying has to be broadened to include communities of countries that maybe weren't on the radar before. So I think it behooves central banks to study the global picture and to coordinate well amongst themselves.
Okay. And in terms of some of the initiatives that we're talking about in the region, you spoke about the Asian Infrastructure Fund, for example, as a missed opportunity for the US. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking there?
So among the things that will allow emerging Asia to reach its promise is the investment in infrastructure that maximizes the region's potential. It's estimated that there's $8 trillion in public works that could be done. And obviously that's not going to get done immediately, but the infrastructure fund that China proposed is a modest start, $50 billion, maybe up to 100. And unfortunately, our government looked at it less as an opportunity in the region and more suspiciously because of the sponsorship of the Chinese. At the end of the day, Western allies decided to sign on as capital contributors and be part of the growth, whereas the US hung back, and it really didn't help our reputation as a friend economically to the region.